Okay, welcome. We're back into the Jordan Peterson class. This is the 14th class. We've been gone for about 9 months on a crazy sabbatical, but we are now going to get started again. So, does anybody want to do the simultaneous sip to get started? Remind ourselves of where we left off. So, get your cup, your mug, your glass, your tankard, your chalice, your stein, your canteen, jug, or flask, your vessel of any kind. Fill it with your favorite liquid. I like coffee, and join me for the unparalleled pleasure, the dopamine hit of the day, the thing that makes literally everything better. It's called the simultaneous sip, and it happens now. Go. Mm. Ah. Oh, that's good stuff. You feel the right down my spine. What a lot of chills. Okay, we're going to get back into Jordan Peterson here. And one of the things I'm excited about, let's sort of recap on everything we've done. But Dr. Tartaglia has some really interesting challenges and struggles with Peterson, and so let's just have a good conversation. So remember, we're doing this class in the context of the Backbone Year 3 course, which is optional, of a few other options, including the Quine course of Nietzsche. So we're looking at him through the lens of children of Nietzsche and thinkers who Nietzsche has sort of made possible. And we've got this quote from Zarathustra, who says, "Long verily should we have to wait until someone reawoke thy God for thee." In part 4, I believe, of Zarathustra, he's speaking to the last in service. Nietzsche was not an atheist, although he sort of was, and that's one of the questions we talk about. So in these lectures, um, we are just going to do a deep dive into Jung and Peterson, Bonjour and Plantinga, and Kierkegaard. And so we've seen Jordan Peterson sort of justify what his project is all about. Why is he renting out a stage and filling it with people to talk about Bible stories? So he talks about Nietzsche, he talks about Jung and Freud and Dostoevsky and Moses and Marduk and the language of narrative. We don't really have to go through all these slides again. We've done it in other videos. His approach is going to be evolutionary. He wants things to be grounded scientifically. He doesn't want to say things that are just not going to get off the ground because they're against what we understand to be scientifically true. He's approaching it from a psychoanalytic perspective. In other words, he's looking for truths to live by. He's looking for stories that can illuminate how an individual who's struggling with life or psychological problems might benefit from reflecting on the stories or wrestling with them. He's going to look at the Bible stories in a literary sense, looking at them as character-based narratives of moving from point A to point B. He's looking for moral lessons. He's looking for practical ways of thinking about the world and practical advice. He wants to be rational, but no more reductionistic than is necessary. And he's going to be phenomenological in his approach. We've talked about all these things in previous videos. So we won't do it more. He talks about the Bible being a hypertext, a hyperlinked text of all of the different connections between all the different verses. He says we've forgotten what are the foundational pillars of our civilization and our culture, and we need to get into these things to understand who we are. That's another way of thinking about what the entire university project is that we're doing here. We're reading Ovid's Metamorphoses. We're reading the best contributors to the philosophical conversation. We've got 3 new classes in literature coming up soon with 3 different professors. So we're trying to look at the greatest works and meditate on who we are and what ideas define our culture. He looks at sources of the Bible and talks about some of that. So we won't go into all this. It's just to remind us of everything he's covered as he's trying to give us some ideas of how he's going to approach the scriptures. He mentions this important verse in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So he's talking about the principle of the Logos. Excuse me. He talks about God as a notion of, well, actually, let's get to what is God. So he has a what is God section. I mean, we're basically into the 3rd video, and each video is about 3 hours long. and he's just getting into the first verses of the first chapter. So this is class 14 where we pick up on all of this, but we're in the third video. We're going to hear from Peterson, and we're going to pause and discuss what he's talking about. But we've really started to put together the pieces of what Peterson's approach is, and so we're only doing this sort of briefly because I know we'll have time to discuss it more as we watch his video today. So, what is God? Well, there's this triune idea that there's three aspects to God, or three. There's a triunity, and we talked about the Trinity at the base of being. We're not going to talk about all that again here. These are in the former videos, but one of the attributes or lists of attributes is God is something like the future. It's something like human consciousness waking up to the fact that we can bargain with the future. It doesn't mean that it's limited to that. He's not reducing it to that, but he's saying the notion of God is something like an all-seeing eye that notices what you're up to. And it seems to like sacrifice. So if you make sacrifices in the present, you can bargain with it for a better future. You can enter into a covenant with it. It answers prayers. He's not saying these things are true. He's saying this is what's true narratively and literarily about the starting point of the Bible, saying, hey, here's this personality, the personality of the divine with which you have to wrestle. What is it like? It's like these things. So he's not arguing to it. He's just saying, if we were to read a novel, what's the character of Alyosha like? It's like this. Well, what's the character of God like? The character of God is transcendent of time and space. It is not nature. It judges and forgives. It punishes and rewards. It can be capricious at the same time, right? With the Job story. It built an Eden for mankind, but then banished us for our disobedience. It's too powerful to be touched. You can't just say his name, right? He's not arguing to these things. He's saying, let's get into the lens of the literature so that we can see what the story's trying to tell us. God's attributes as the sun is that it speaks chaos into order, right? It speaks order into chaos. It slays dragons and feeds people with the remains. It finds gold. It rescues virgins. It's the body and blood of Christ. It's the tragic victim and scapegoat and eternally triumphant redeemer simultaneously. It cares for the outcast. It dies and is reborn. So there's an Ouroboros here. There's a Phoenix here. There's a Marduk here. It's basically all of the different hero stories, and then the meta hero stories, and then the meta hero stories, the mythopoetic stories are trying to get at the way of being in the world that makes the world habitable, that makes life flourish, that infuses within the chaotic, potentially predatory capacity for evil and catastrophe and malevolence in this world and in this milieu. What is it that comes into that and then speaks order into it and makes it better? What is this thing that can call itself the truth, that can say it is love? It dies and is reborn. It's the King of Kings and Hero of Heroes. It is not the state, but it is both the fulfillment and the critic of the state, right? We got to see two types of hero stories, especially when we did our lecture on Apollo and Daphne. We got to see the hero that looks at the chaos, throws a conceptual net over it, has eyes around its head, is paying attention, speaks magic words, cuts into pieces, and then builds the world out of it. But then we also have the overconfidence of the system, the paternalistic, tyrannical system that says, I define all things and you fit where I tell you to fit. And the hero like Daphne, or the hero like Socrates, or the hero like Christ, which looks at that all too confident system and says, no, not good enough. I am the truth, and then accepts the consequences of being turned into a tree or drinking the hemlock or being crucified. So it's both the critic and the fulfillment of the state. It dwells in the perfect house. It is aimed at paradise or heaven. It can rescue from hell. It cares for the outcast. It is the foundation stone and the cornerstone that was rejected, and it is the spirit of the law. God's attributes as spirit, he says, it is akin to the human soul. It has a prophetic voice. It is the still small voice. It is the spoken truth. It is called forth by music. It is the enemy of deceit, arrogance, and resentment. That's a cool formula from Peterson. It is the water of life. It burns without consuming. It is a blinding light. Now, none of these things are being argued to. Again, these are Peterson reading the text and saying, it seems like the text is telling me God is this type of thing. He's a triune thing with a lot of these different attributes. So he got into the first verse, and then we talked. Here's where we'll pause a little bit and we'll refresh. Let's talk about Peterson's approach. So the first topic is, what is the significance of mythopoetic scriptures in general? Where does this language play a role? For Peterson, there are all sorts of questions which we as human beings we have forced upon us, that we must wrestle with, that are not amenable to some sort of empirical or propositional resolution. They're characterological, they're rooted in personality, they have more to do with the way you move forward in life, how you're oriented, what you care about, wishing upon the highest star, being oriented towards the highest possible good. And to answer those types of questions, what you have to do is say, hey, let me introduce you to somebody. His name's Hamlet. He's like this. Here's this other guy named Horatio. He's like this. And then you smash those characters up against each other. You watch them move from point A to point B and smash against obstacles. And you get the appropriate vocabulary of literature, which is used to manifest characters. You don't say Hamlet is like this. You say, here's Hamlet, meet him. And then you watch what he does and you see what he's like. And then scriptural stories are sort of a meta version of that. And they say, okay, I'm talking to you as if you're a person, as if you have personality, as if you're a character, and as if the most important questions to you are those types of questions. And I'm saying, okay, here's how Isaac wrestles with God. Here's how Jacob wrestles with God. Here's how Abraham moves forward in faith and responds to the call that calls him out from the land of his fathers into an adventure where he doesn't have all the answers. Here's how Joseph can be thrown into a pit and say, how do I make this place better? Here's how he can be raised up to be the head of Potiphar's household and say, how can I make this place better? Here's how he can be lied about and thrown in prison and say, how do I make this place better, right? Very different from Jacob, who's wrestling with God and trying to use deceit to accomplish his destiny of pushing the kingdom forward and being the patriarch that moves things forward and has the destiny upon him, and then having to learn 14 years of karmic retribution and wrestle with God properly in order to make amends. And right, so these are just different ways of wrestling with the divine and wrestling with nature and being oriented properly towards the family and the state, where we've got these characters who just say, well, you could try it this way, here's what will happen to you. You can try it this way, here's what's going to happen. You can be Cain and be full of bitter resentment at the unfairness of being a limited creature, which necessitates pain and struggle and catastrophe and malevolence and all sorts. It might not necessitate malevolence. We just add that onto it to make it even worse. But you might become resentful of all of that and say, I'm sacrificing, I'm trying, and God's not smiling on my sacrifices. Maybe I should pick up a rock and murder the thing I wish I was. So it's like, how do you come back from that? Well, here's a story that shows Cain unable to come back from that. And it's a warning, right? So he's saying, approach the mythopoetic stories the way we're talking about here. The second thing is, and I've listened to these lectures of his like about 20 times, and I've tried to pull out what I call the Jungian keys that he's using to approach these stories. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the ones that I think he has, because for every 18 months or so, I'd get this impulse to say, I should go and read the Greek and Roman myths, because I bet there's a lot of valuable stuff in there. And I would go and read them, and about 10 minutes later, I'd throw the book aside or the web page, I'd close out of the tab. I'd be like, I can't make sense of this. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's just Apollo has a lyra and he kills a person, and he's the god of the bringing the sun up, and also he slays Python. What is this? It just sounds like 28 different random things put together. Who could possibly orient their calendar and their civilization and their lifestyle around such strange stories? But then I listened to these lectures and I said, no, wait a minute, this is a different way of approaching the stories. Maybe I thought there are keys to have ears to hear. And so I listened very carefully, like I swear, at least 20 times to these lectures. And I thought, okay, how is he approaching these stories? And I called it the Jungian keys, and I tried to extract them from his lectures. And one of them is something like, presume that your ancestors, who were living in a catastrophic milieu and who thrived and became your ancestors, unlike their competitors who died without leaving a legacy, presumed that they had to pay ridiculously careful attention to who they were and what sort of world they were living in. And then they came up with stories to tell themselves what that was. And that the stories that they oriented their cultures around weren't accidentally helpful in turning rock throwing, poop wielding apes into cathedral builders and pyramid builders, but rather their stories were good enough to compete with the neighboring tribes that had worse stories, or just the realities that they were contending with in nature. So, in other words, approach the story as if it probably is more profound than you think. That's step one. Step two is to say, okay, how could it be that a story could be that profound? And if we're going to be Darwinian evolutionists, we might say something like, I am the product of the environment selecting and chiseling away anything that doesn't fit in well with it amongst my ancestry. And what nature produced was a personality with a subconscious that reverberates with these stories. Wait, what? Whatever it was that was in the environment that said, okay, this is the thing that will be able to thrive in this environment. The thing that will thrive is the thing that has these stories written into its subconscious in some way. That's a kind of evidence that the Greek gods are personal forces, that the story is actually talking about and getting close to a true depiction of the nature of the divine and the nature of nature itself, and whatever it is that constitutes our reality and that reality for our ancestors, so that it would produce creatures who could understand such strange stories. All right, let's not go into all of the Jungian keys right now, but these are just basically starting points of attitudes for approaching it. Let's see. He talks about the archetypes. We've got this in other videos. We don't have to go into all of this again. We talk about the difference between symbols and signs and Kiki and Boo Boo and all that stuff. The appropriate respect for the story, what constitutes our reality. Okay, so this is important for Peterson. Peterson has two terms that he likes to use for sort of the most important principles that constitute reality, and they're order and chaos. And he says, now, here's something he's never said explicitly, but which makes sense. If that is, whatever that is, if that is everything, if that's the source of everything, if everything emerges by the dance, the Taoistic dance between the yin and the yang, then everything should be a reflection of that. And so one of the answers to how a story can be so profound that it's true on every level of analysis is if the story is about the archetypes. If it's about the arche, right? If it's about the archetypes, then it's about the thing that is fundamentally a constitutive part of being. And so it should play itself out on all levels of analysis. So one of the ways that could work is you have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere in your brain. And Peterson likes talking about psychology and say, we're coming to this conclusion in the science that one half of your brain is a model imposing monster. That it says, here's how I make sense of everything, and then it imposes that model on everything it experiences and is cognitively blind to anything that doesn't fit its model. And then the other part of your brain is the part that's making up all sorts of ghosts and phantasms, saying, what could be? It could be anything. There could be anything out there. I just stick my hand in a dark room and watch my imagination make things up. And he says, okay, so one part of your brain is making up what could possibly be true and imagining things. And that's sort of the realm of chaos. And the other side is saying, here's how it all makes sense, and let me impose it on the world. And if you're two in either of those worlds, you're kind of in hell. Right? If you're in a world where you're just cognitively blind to anything that doesn't fit what you presume to be true, you just keep banging your head against a wall for all eternity until you've got a bloody noggin. But if you're in a paranoid schizophrenic state where I don't understand anything, I'm in a skeptical hole and anything could be real, and it's like now you're the prey of monsters. So what you need is the psychological health of the communication between the hemispheres. And You could think of masculine and feminine as means of depicting those two principles, but you could also say it's not accidental that the species would develop sexual selection with two genders, and that they would also be a reflection. Evolutionary life would be a reflection of this thing if this thing is the source of all that there is. You would say it's not accidental that there would be a left and a right politically, and that one would really love walls, and that the other would really hate walls and want to drill holes in walls and say, hey, we need new information. So we don't have to talk about it much more, but we've seen this emerge that for Peterson, order and chaos are the two most important principles. He gives us the Marduk story to illustrate that. He talks about the spirit of God hovering over the deeps, right? And the communication between the two is the logos. We can think of it as the Holy Spirit, Father God, and Christ. Okay, so this is the part that I think is going to be most interesting to discuss with Dr. Tartaglia, which is how the heck is Peterson going to justify saying, I want to be scientific and objective and rational as I can, and at the same time, I want to go swimming in the chaotic ocean of mythopoetry and dream, and ooh, it's just monsters coming out of the chaos, and talk about all of that. So to me, I think Peterson sees it something like this. Science is a very limited field, but it can shoot up with pillars. It can go very far and do things that you can't do if you're not restricted to that realm of consideration and that realm of rules. And that itself is maybe nested in a philosophical propositional language of the rules of right reason. I know this is a different way of thinking about it than the Quinean way, but we're just going to talk about Peterson for a second. But then Peterson, like Jung, wants to say that philosophical propositional language, or the rules of right reason, where you can do ethics and talk about things beyond just empirically verifiable or falsifiable or consequential notions, that itself is nested in something like a myth dream narrative language. We had to first do some cave paintings, and we had to first make some little statues of little Venuses, and we had to first perform dramas for the community. And before we could do any of that, we had to dream, and we had to dream the image of what it meant to be heroic, and what it meant to be honest, and what it meant to be good. And as the greatest dreamers, the prophets, the authors, are having better pictures of what those forms are like, which again, from a Jungian perspective, they're emerging out of our subconscious, they're written into us. As they're getting better pictures of that, they're telling better stories. They're making better statues. They've got statues of David and Venus and Cupid triumphant, and all of these things that are sort of saying, it's like this, it looks like this. Here's some cave paintings. Here's some hand imprints. Here's some animals on a cave wall. Here's a play. Here's a story. Here's a creation myth. Here's a story about Abraham. Here's a drama. Here's a song. And they're saying, it looks like this. It looks like this. Now, there's some complications here. It's like, okay, how are we going to start drilling into a dream world and have any confidence at all? What if we're reading the wrong story? What if we're projecting our own nightmares onto the story and just making things up? What are we going to do? We want to drill into this area here and get something. Well, okay, first of all, we could be drilling in completely the wrong place. Secondly, we could think we just pulled something out of our pocket, but we pretend we found it, but we didn't really. We're just projecting. Look what I found. No, you came here with that. So what do? Well, the first thing we do is this, and Peterson uses this phrase a lot. He says, I think it means at least this much, or it seems to me like it means at least that much, I think. What is he doing? He's saying we can't get rid of the story. The story is the deepest language there is for talking to us about who we are and what world it is that we inhabit. So we're not getting rid of it, but as philosophers, we're going and we're trying to extract propositional statements that we could use to describe the world. And we're kind of saying the story seems to be telling me something like this, but of course more than this. So it means at least that much, I think, is a phrase he likes to use. The first rule for having a safety harness, I really think this is how he's doing it. If you're going to tie yourself to the land or to an anchor or to a lifeline, is to say, as soon as I think I've extracted something out of the story that I could put in propositional form, I'm in the realm of philosophy now. Let me go to the ethicist Let me go to the metaphysicist. Let me say, I've got to argue for this. You are the final arbiters of propositional statements. And what might happen is I might say, I read the story badly. I took from the story the idea that we should live this way. I went to the ethicists and they said, well, that's a really bad idea. And we can tell you why. And it's self-contradictory and it leads to absurdities. So no, you're wrong. And then I can say, shucks, maybe I read the story badly. Or maybe I read the wrong story. Or maybe there's something wrong with me that stops me from reading the story correctly. Or maybe the story is correct and I have read it correctly, and I need to make a better argument to win the case amongst the philosophers. It doesn't matter. What matters is it's in the philosophical realm. When we've got propositions, that's where we adjudicate whether or not they work. Likewise, it would be very rare to imagine coming to some sort of a scientific proposition out of these stories. So that would probably be extremely rare. There are stories where there are individuals who say, I read a line in scripture which talked about the paths of the sea, and then I started a whole global project for mapping out the currents of the ocean because I figured they must exist. It's like, okay, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, right? Like you wanted to study the ocean and you got this idea that it had currents and you studied them, and then maybe you also read this text. But maybe you read the text and it talked about the paths of the sea and you thought, oh my, there's something to that. I'm going to go and look for the paths that exist in the sea. And then, but the point is, you have no idea if there are paths in the sea until you tell the Royal Navy to start dropping bottles with notes. And when you find a bottle, write down where you found it and what time you found it and drop it back in the ocean again. And that's what you have to do to decide if you've actually got scientific truth. So more regularly, though, the story is not going to give us propositional truths, although we might find some as we wrestle with the story. It's definitely not going to give us a lot of scientific truths. And by the way, if we think we've read the story to give us a scientific truth and we take it to the scientists and they say that's nonsense, the consequences of that idea would make the experiment work differently than the experiment works. So you're wrong. We just have to say, I read the story badly, or I read the wrong story. I didn't get what I was supposed to get out of the story. It doesn't work because the scientists are the final arbiters of that. So this allows us a safety net for going into this realm of dream without coming out with a bunch of notions that are completely absurd and irrational, that outrage reason, that go against science, and then getting lost in all of that. We can actually still use the philosophical principles and the scientific restrictions to say, okay, I'm not going to talk in those realms unless I deal with the arbiters of those realms properly. But more regularly, the point of the dream myth, mythopoetic narrative language is to give us truths to live by. And truths to live by are different. And I know we're going to have quarrel about using the word truth and using the word knowledge in this context, but we might say something like truth sub 1, truth sub 2, and truth sub 3 for what the word truth means in these different realms. But we're looking for truths to live by. We can say the arrow flies straight and true. It means it's oriented properly, it's integral enough within itself to accept the force of the bow, to shoot in the right direction, and to find its mark. You say, I will be true, my darling. It means you know me to be the character who's in love with you and wouldn't betray you. And while you get on a plane and go to England for a couple of weeks, I will be true. I will be that character while you're gone, right? So we're looking for truths to live by more than propositional statements that we could assent to, or even more rarely scientific insights.
Excuse me, can we pause there and
Perfect.
talk about that?
Let's do that. Yeah.
Aren't you just saying that truth or a truth or truths in the plural, those terms are ambiguous? Sometimes they mean loyal. I'll be true to you. Loyal.
Mm-hmm.
The arrow travels straight and true. It goes in a continuous path without without bumps and that sort of thing. Uh, um, uh, but just because we have those different meanings doesn't mean that they have anything to do with truth,
Yes.
which I think is inherently propositional. I don't.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, it's proposi- it's declarative sentences that are true or false.
Yes.
So
That's
your dichotomy between propositional knowledge and other kinds of knowledge just uh, doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I understand, and this is going to be one of your problems with Peterson's approach, I think. I would suggest that there is an analogy between truth sub one, truth sub two, and truth sub three. There's an analogy between knowledge sub one, knowledge sub two, and knowledge sub three, and belief sub one, belief sub two, and belief sub three.
well, yeah, but you can do that with anything. Uh, um, um, jam, jam is JAM or JAMB. Uh, 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 Traffic jam and preservatives. What do they have in common? If you think enough, you
Mushiness,
come up with they're both sticky situations.
smushy. Yep.
Uh, so you can't.
That would be a very loose metaphorical analogy between the jamming of the traffic and the jamming of the fruit to create jam.
Right, right.
That's a very, very loose and tenuous metaphorical connection for an analogy. I think the analogy between knowledge and truth in the scientific realm and knowledge and truth in the dream realm is stronger than that. So maybe there we could consider a spectrum of metaphor where it's very loosely metaphorical. You could say what you just said was brilliant, which means it's illuminating my thinking and it's illuminating my world. That's very metaphorical. It has nothing to do with electromagnetic radiation. But you could have a more closely tight knit analogy. And the reason why Peterson, and you can disagree with him on this for sure, but the reason why Peterson, I think, is seeing a tighter connection between these ideas is that for him, there are scientific experiments happening to adjudicate the stories that we have. So, first of all, there's memory. And in the realm of science, an individual scientist can adopt consciously the scientific method and utilize it properly. It's very hard to do. It's easier to do with a team of people keeping check on you. But a guy like Richard Feynman can just think scientifically and he can develop an idea and he can develop an experiment and he can convince his peers to agree with him about positrons traveling backwards in time as electrons and whatever else he was showing. But in the dream narrative realm, it's more like millennia going by. It's more like entire lifetimes going by. It's entire cultures rising and falling. And what the experiments that are being performed are personal. So you look inside yourself and you see if you have a God to relate to. You see if you have a notion of a divine that you want to be in orientation properly with. You ask yourself, does it feel like something to be in the world? Is it like something to see yellow? Is pain a qualitative experience? Um, am I a person who has a narrative and am I trying to get to a certain endpoint? So you can do the personal experiment yourself to see that it's true. But the problem is the way you live out your life, the consequences of the experiment might not be realized for a couple of centuries. So there's no one individual who can do this work. You have prophets who can have insights that are helpful over millennia. But what you really have are a few editors of the stories. And the first editor of the story is culture, which functions through memory. So I pass the story on to my children, who pass it on to their children. And the only parts they pass on are what they remember. So only the memorable parts of the story are passed on, so that the story starts to chip away all of the extra pieces that don't really matter, and only what resonates with our memory is what we actually pass on and remember by definition. And then the second thing that happens is this family, this culture, this civilization, that's this fledgling civilization, is telling itself stories about who it is and how it should relate to nature. Well, if the story isn't good enough, it's going to get wiped out by a landslide. If the story isn't good enough, it's not going to have the proper respect for nature, and disease is going to wipe it out. If the story isn't good enough, it's going to be one of the tribes that fail to reproduce and leave a legacy, whereas the other tribe that has a slightly better story might preserve. Now, eventually, that can give birth to philosophy, and eventually, that can give birth to science, where you can really tell yourself very good stories. But the truths and the knowledges of the dream world are come before those other types of truths and knowledge. So we like to, as philosophers, say truth is propositional. It's a statement that can be true or false. But what Peterson is saying is, let's go to Jung and let's go to Nietzsche, who say this is actually anchored in something deeper. And if our philosophy isn't working because we actually have to be oriented in a certain way, and it's characterological, which is why Nietzsche gives us a narrative of Zarathustra. It's why Socrates says on the day that he dies, what we're doing here is trying to relate properly to the source of all truth, being justice, goodness, and love. It's why Plato is giving us narrative of dialogue in order to talk about something that's a little bit deeper than just something that can be the conclusion of a syllogism. So while we're doing philosophy, the greatest philosophers are saying, yeah, we're doing arguments here, and that's really fun, but it's nested in something deeper. So so the first thing is memory. The second thing is nature itself could wipe us out. And then the third thing is neighboring tribes can be in competition with us. They can also be in cooperation. We can borrow insights from the stories of neighboring tribes and incorporate that into our idea of the divine or our idea of nature and change our stories. But also, we could go to war with each other over things that are much more important than salt or oil. We could go to war with each other over what's the right way to interpret the Trinity. And we think to ourselves, what a silly reason to go to war. But the medievals would have looked at us and said, you went to war for oil? Golly, I mean, holy mackerel. Well, first of all, going to war for oil or salt makes a lot of sense, but it also is a mirror image of going to war over what's the right way to submit to the divine if you're fighting with Islam, or to wrestle with the divine if you're Jewish, or to follow Christ if you're Christian. And so these tribes are at war with each other, and if they wipe each other out, their stories aren't preserved. If they're in cooperation with each other, they might borrow insights from each other's stories. If their story isn't good enough, nature might wipe them out in a catastrophe. And if their story isn't memorable enough, that part of the story won't get passed on verbally as you pass the story on. And then you say, okay, by definition, anthropologically, if a culture doesn't change for 100,000 years, then it stays the same. If it's not changing, it's staying the same. And if it's staying the same, that means its story isn't changing. But maybe 90,000 years in, its story changes a bit. And then its entire culture changes a bit. It has a new celebration, a new holiday, a new way, a new deity to consider and sacrifice to. So the stories are a mirror image of the culture and the civilization's attempts to understand who they are in the world and how to move forward from point A to point B, push the kingdom of heaven forward one more generation. And it's through that lens that Peterson is going to look at the Genesis stories. And he's going to, what emerges in the Genesis stories is you've got this Adam and Eve fall from paradise into consciousness, where you understand pain and the future and limitation and vulnerability and evil, because now you know how you could hurt others, into a Cain and Abel type story. And then 4 stories that say, what would be a better way of sacrificing than the Cain way? Instead of killing your ideal for the sake of the present, maybe you can sacrifice the present for the sake of the future. Maybe you can do that in a way where God will smile on it. And one of the things that I would add really quickly to that is that the Bible is insulting to us, except for the fact that it includes the book of Job. because it's not a morality tale. Just because Genesis is wrestling with the proper way to wrestle with God in order to thrive and eventually get to a Joseph way of being, it throws in the book of Job, which is even older than Genesis, and says, you know what, you could do everything right, and there's actually cosmic forces at work here, and maybe you're just going to fall afoul of the fact that God and the devil are making a bet. And things, it's not a morality tale. Do X and get rewarded with Y. Which is nice, because at least the story isn't insulting us and talking to us like we're infants. So I recognize that. I recognize a lot of. I think in the course of our 9 years of talking about this is an epistemological question between us. Is that I kind of want to grant everything you say about the superiority of the quality of scientific knowledge and philosophical knowledge. I want to say, don't ever forget that. Don't forget, when you're in the realm of dream, that this isn't solid. It isn't. It's ocean like. It's not able to go as high or as far or to construct as much of a constructive advance, and it can't build an iPad, it can't build a spaceship. It's not that type of knowledge, but it is grounding, and it is maybe profound, and maybe it predates, and maybe it's what the rest of it is nestled in. And it's Jung and Nietzsche and Peterson who are the Platonic voices of the philosophical conversation today, trying to tell us that that's legitimate, and we need to be anchored and rooted in something that is more profound than just syllogistic and propositional. But I know I shouldn't say the word just propositional, because we're philosophers, and so that's the big thing for us. But the propositional is grounded in our desire to make the world a better place, our desire to be aimed at something valuable, the eternity that's within our heart, our desire, our orientation towards making the world a better place, that doesn't get found in a microscope. It's not found in a telescope, and you can't even argue to it. This is what Nietzsche's insight in Zarathustra is: the way of being that is demonic and nihilistic has no argument to convince me to be like that. Likewise, the way of being that says yes to being, the Zarathustra way of being, has no argument to convince you to be like it. It's actually who you are in the world. That's what it boils down to. You can be Socratic, you can be a life affirmer, you can be Zarathustrian, or you could be nihilistic in a demonic way, and you can say, it would be better to burn this whole thing. You can be resentful. You can be the sort of Cain-like way of being in the world. And there's no propositional argument to convince you to move from one to the other, or maybe not even a propositional medicine to bring you from one to the other. Now, if you're confused, doing good philosophy can get your ideas clear so that you can more easily find the correct niche for you, perhaps. Maybe Aristotle has some habitual ways where you can change your character, whatever. But the language of the mythopoetic is about who you are as a character. It's narrative based, and the characters exist in the world. The Mephistophelian way of being is a way of being. And what it says is the suffering and the misery is so horrible that it doesn't justify the project to begin with. And what would be better is the rapid nuclear war to bring all this suffering to an end as quickly as possible. That is a way that you can be oriented in the world. The problem with it, maybe logically, is you just make everything worse when you take on that attitude. But there's another problem, which is that that's not a good enough argument to go against it. It's a strong argument. The devil is always represented as intellectually very impressive. There's a strong argument for it, and there maybe isn't an argument to convert you from one side to the other. It's you read the stories and they resonate with you, and you figure out what could be actualized about the potential of your character by meeting the characters who are actually more that way of being, either the Joseph Christ-like Logos way, the Marduk way, or the Cain-like resentful destroy everything sort of way of being. It's just a different language. But Philosophers, good philosophers, post-Cartesian philosophers, contemporary philosophers, Quinian philosophers, Aristotelian philosophers. There's all sorts of philosophers who don't want to hear any of this. They don't want to live in a world of clouds. They don't want to be platonically floating up into the ideal realms and dealing with this way of thinking because it's too uncertain, it's too metamorphic, it's too, I mean, Ovid's Metamorphoses, it's too ever changing, it's not reliable enough, it's not solid enough, it's not the sort of thing that I can confidently say, look, mofos, I've got a deductive argument. It leads to this conclusion. You can't deny it. I've proven a contradiction. It's just not that kind of language. So we can ignore it, or like Nietzsche and Jung and Jordan Peterson, we can say, let's tie a belt around ourselves and anchor ourselves to the philosophical and the scientific, but let's go diving into the chaotic ocean. And I think this is partly why Nietzsche said your highest growths cannot be realized unless your roots go down to the deepest depths. And Jung mirrored the same thing.
And how are how are you to convince me that you're right? That your view of the world, that your view of history and all of that is right, is correct.
Wait, there's two questions there. Well, first, how am I to convince you that it's true that we should look at the mythopoetic, or how am I to convince you that my interpretation of the mythopoetic was correct?
The second.
Okay, the second one. All right. I mean, the first one you already believe, so I don't have to convince you. You already believe that you're a character with significance and aim and all of that other stuff, so we don't worry. But the second one, that's a hard question to answer because the first thing we could do is if we're in the realm of arguing, we're back here. And if we're back here, I can have all of my ideas rooted in ancient mythopoetry. That doesn't make them right. And if we're in the realm of you and I arguing about what's right, we just have to do it propositionally. We have to do it with the rules of right reason. We have to study ethics and metaphysics and ontology and epistemology. And we just have to have those discussions. So I can't, it would be inappropriate for me to say to you, I disagree, and what you should do is go read Hamlet. Or I disagree because you don't believe the right scriptures, and you should just go read those scriptures. I mean, if I want to disagree with you and make a case for something, I have to just make arguments based in reason. And I think that's all I have to, I mean, the twin sister of philosophy might be theology. So if we are in a framework where we agree about which texts are holy, we could have a theological discussion, but we have to apply the rules of right reason to our theological doctrines and see what the consequences are. But if you and I are just going to agree or just going to disagree about what I think I've pulled out and extracted as propositional statements from the story, I have to just make arguments based in reason. I can't say, but the story says this, because the truth is I could have read the story differently and you could read the story differently. And it's kind of a waste of your time for me to say, well, why don't you go look at the story? Because if I've got something to argue, I should just argue it. But that doesn't mean that you and I shouldn't spend as much time as we can saturating ourselves in the sorts of stories and art and mythopoetry which took poop-throwing, rock-wielding apes and turned them into cathedral builders and pyramid builders. That is the basis and foundation of our culture. And if our culture has earthquakes and cracks in it, we need to get back in touch with the medicine that made us able to function as a civilization in the first place. So I can encourage you to read, and I'm reminded quid rides, mutato nomine. When you approach these stories, why are you laughing? Why do you find them ridiculous? Change only but the names, and the story's about you. Okay, so we can encourage each other to say we should be caring about these stories. We should be reading them and meditating on them and wrestling with them. But what we should never do, especially not as philosophers, is say, I'm going to start preaching. I'm going to start preaching that I've read the story correctly, that I understand it correctly, that I've read the right version of the story, that I paid attention to the correct story to pay attention to, that I've accurately pulled out the meaning of the story. Everybody listen to me. Now, what I could do is I could retell the story, and that might be a worthwhile thing, but I don't get to do that from a position of authority. I don't get to say, I'm the new Moses, and let me tell you the real history of Abraham, or let me tell you the story of Abraham with all of the right emphasis. No, I have to retell the story as if I'm listening to it and reading it again, and we can read it together. But I don't get to say, see, I told you about what happens in the narrative, so therefore you have to agree with my interpretation of it. I have to just join the philosophical conversation, I think, to do what you're asking me to do, at which point I have no appeal that I can make to the fact that I think I got my idea from the story. I could have read the story wrong. I could have made a mistake. I could have been projecting. I could have brought my own problems or interpretive lenses or splinters in my eye to the story that make me read it incorrectly. Is that my question to you? Is that an acceptable response? Right? If I come to you and I say I'm willing to play the philosophical game on its own merits, with its own restrictions, in its own realm, but what informs my instincts in trying to think about the world is rereading Ovid's Metamorphoses and the King James version of Genesis. I'm not going to ever be able to say, well, Genesis 3:4 says X. I don't even know what that verse is. So that could have been a dangerous thing to do. But I don't get to say, John 1:1 says X, therefore I'm right. I don't get to win arguments that way. That's an illicit move if you and I are going to debate something.
Well, but we've all had experiences in life, and you can start there. Take the story of well, Jesus said when ill is done to you, return good instead, and that will be like pouring hot coals on the head of your opponent.
Right.
Now, from our own personal experience, we realize that works.
Yeah.
That you can win the day by returning good for ill, and then you can say, you see, Jesus knew that, and he put it, and the writers of the Bible put it in the story.
Yep.
But
okay, so I know you.
I don't see why the knowledge and the truths you get from these stories can't be gotten from well-written psychology books,
Maybe.
where the author is well-read and has got a lot of experience, and
Sure. Maybe. The stories are pretty profound. They're pretty deep. So maybe. Peterson might suspect that you're right about that. It's not clear because he keeps using it means at least this much. I like imitating his hand gestures when I say things. He says, it means at least this much, I think. But yeah, he's spinning an idea out of nothing. So he likes to say that, but he also likes to illustrate psychological truths as they exist in the stories. One of the things we should have said earlier is that the Bible is not just mythopoetry. So if I read about an argument that Socrates makes about how you understand sameness, but you shouldn't because nothing in the world has ever been the same as anything else in the world, so you must have
but you can't use as examples narratives where the speaker engages in propositional arguments.
What I'm saying is that's what Christ was doing. So Christ sometimes was telling parables, but sometimes he was engaging in psychology and
Yeah.
philosophical arguments and propositional statements. So I'm saying that, like Socrates, if I read Plato's dialogue and I see how Socrates interacts with Euthyphro, I'm getting characterological knowledge of how to be academic, how to have the true spirit of academia and the Socratic daemon possess me or influence me to approach truth as if others care about truth too, even when they clearly don't. But if I read his actual argument, where he's saying syllogistically, well, is it good because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's good? That's a different
Yeah,
thing.
that's something else.
But they can both be in the same story. So, likewise, there's history in the Bible, there's mythopoetry in the Bible, there's philosophy in the Bible, right? There's a lot of philosophy in Job, there's a lot of philosophy in Proverbs, there's a lot of philosophy in Ecclesiastes. There's all sorts of passages in the Bible which are just people propositionally arguing with God or with each other to try to work out what they think are the true propositional statements to assent to which to assent. But then there's also the narrative of the way Job is as he's debating with his friends. And there's the real interesting fact that that God speaks, maybe Christ, God speaks to Job and says to his friends, he says, "Thou hath not spoken rightly of me as my servant Job has." So after 30 chapters of Job debating with his friends about do good and good things happen, well, you're being punished because you must have sinned and all this other stuff. By the way, all of those verses of Job's friends talking are cross-referenced in the rest of the Bible. So those are true statements, but not in this case. So the book of Job is saying, well, wait a minute, here, according to the Bible, here's a bunch of truths that wise theological people, well informed and well read, might understand through the Christian lens or the Judeo lens, but they don't apply here because this character is different. God's doing a different thing here. The cosmic debate is happening. And so the characters being who they are matter narratively and psychologically and mythopoetically, but also the arguments that are being made matter. And so there's poetry, there's songs, there's history, there's theology, there's philosophy, and there's mythopoetry in the Bible. And we can read Socrates and Plato's version of Socrates as having multiple different ways of reading it. We can read it as literature, we can read it as philosophy, we can read it as mythopoetry, and we have to do the same thing with Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and we have to do the same thing in the Bible. In the Bible, God says, "Come, let us reason together. Let's debate, let's hash it out, let's talk out the ideas until we get them clear." Okay, so you can philosophize with God right in the Bible. There's also negotiation with God. Abraham's like, "Hey, God, would you really destroy the city for a lack of five? And let's go back and forth until we can say, okay, when does disaster come? If we have just a few good people, can we keep the civilization going? Or is the divine pissed off at how bad it's gotten that it's going to have to be collapsed and destroyed?" So the characters matter and the way they talk matters, but also the things they're saying matter. And sometimes Christ is making psychological points, sometimes he's making philosophical arguments, sometimes he's telling parables, and sometimes he's just being the truth. He's being the way of being in the world that looks at it and says, "I'll willingly accept suffering and sacrifice and crucifixion in order to give to the world what it needs to be redeemed." Um, so we have to be aware of that while we approach the stories as well. I think that's an answer. Does that answer the question? Is it even on topic?
Not at all.
Oh, okay, good. It's that's good to know. Let me stop
Yeah, I'm getting a
rambling.
little tired now
Okay.
and sweaty.
All right. Well, this
When
is I'm sorry. So this is class 14 of Jordan Peterson's deep dive, and we're in the third video of his biblical series. We can call it quits. We're only about an hour in. That was about how long we did the other videos on this course. So let's just see where we left off.
The idea that there's, I'll go back. it's partly the idea that, well, let me figure out how to start this properly. Friend of mine, business partner, and a guy that I've written scientific papers with, very smart guy, took me to task, and I think I told you this a little bit, about using the term dominance hierarchy, which might be fine for like chimpanzees and for lobsters and for creatures like that, but not for chimpanzees even so much. And he said something very interesting. He thought that the idea of dominance hierarchy was actually a projection of a early 20th century quasi-Marxist hypothesis onto the animal kingdom that was being observed. And the notion that the hierarchical structure that you see that characterizes, say, mating hierarchies in chimps, for example, the idea that that was predicated on power was actually a projection of a kind of political ideology. And I thought, that really bugged me for a long time when he said that, because I'd really been used to using the term dominance hierarchy, and I thought, he told me all that, I thought, that's so annoying. It's so annoying, because it might be right, and it took me months to think about it. And then I was also reading Franz de Waal at the same time, and he's a primatologist, and also Jack Panksepp, who's a brilliant affective.
So we have both of those books here, and in our deep dive of Peterson, we are going to look into the works that he recommends.
Neuroscientist who unfortunately just died. He wrote a great book called Affective Neuroscience, and for rats to play, they have to play fair, or they won't play with each other. That's a staggering discovery, right? Because anything that helps instantiate the emergence of ethical behavior in animals, and that associates it with an evolutionary process, which is essentially what Panksepp was doing, gives credence to the notion that the ethics that guide us are not mere sociological epiphenomenal constructs. They're deeply rooted. If rats, and they're rats for God's sake, you can't trust them, and they still play fair, you know. And de Waal noticed that the chimp troops that he studied, like it wasn't the barbaric chimp that ruled with an iron fist that was the successful ruler, because he kept getting torn to shreds by the compatriots that he ignored and stomped on. As soon as he showed some weakness, they'd just tear him into pieces. The chimp leaders that were stable, you know, that had a stable kingdom, let's say, were very reciprocal in terms of their interactions with their friends. And chimps have friends, and they actually last for a very long time, chimp friendships. And they were also very reciprocal in their interactions with the females and with the infants. And I thought Franz de Waal is a very smart guy. And I thought that was also foundational science, because it's really something to note that the attributes that give rise to dominance in a male dominance hierarchy, sorry to use that word, let's call it authority, that might be better, or even shudder competence, which I think is a better way of thinking about it, is that that's not predicated purely on anything that's as simple as brute power. And I think too, you know, I think as well that the idea, and this is a deeply devious and dangerous political idea in my estimation, the idea that male hierarchies are fundamentally predicated on power in a law-abiding society, I think all you have to do is think about that for like a month, say, which isn't that long, to understand how absurd that is, because most people who are in positions of authority, let's say, are just as hemmed in by ethical responsibility, or even more so, than people at the other levels of the hierarchy. And we know this even in the managerial literature, because we know, generally speaking, that managers are more stressed by their subordinates than the subordinates are stressed by their managers. And that's not surprising. You know, you want to be responsible for like 200 people? You really want that? That's hard work, man. And I mean, I know it's a pain to have a boss, because you have to care about what the boss thinks. And maybe the person is arbitrary, in which case they're not going to be particularly successful. But it's no joke to be responsible for 200 people. And you have to behave very carefully when you're in a position of responsibility and authority like that, because you will get called out if you make mistakes constantly. So it's not like because you have a position that's higher up in the hierarchy that you're less constrained by ethical necessity. Now, if you're a psychopath, well, that's a whole different story. But psychopaths have to move pretty rapidly from hierarchy to hierarchy, right? Because they get found out quite quickly. And as soon as their reputation is shattered, then they can't get away with their shenanigans anymore. So, okay, so all of this is to say that there is something very interesting about the pattern of behavior. So imagine that sexual selection is working something like this. And we know that sexual selection is a very, 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 very powerful biological force, even though biologists ignored it for almost 100 years after Charles Darwin originally wrote about it. thinking mostly about natural selection. They didn't like the idea of sexual selection because it tended to introduce the notion of mind into the process of evolution, because it deals with choice. But so imagine on the one hand that you have a male hierarchy. We know that the
Okay. Since we're not able to get into too much of this, you said you were
Okay, we can postpone
reaching an
this.
end.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's super interesting. The synthesis of natural selection and Darwinianism with epigenetic Lamarckian and Palean sexual selection is, I think, a trend that's going to happen in the near future, and it's just going to be super interesting. So why don't we just take this off and we'll go into the after show, and we'll end the stream right now. But at least we're back into it, and we'll pick up from there when we do this again next week, and we'll listen to the
Okay,
rest of
good.
this lecture. All right.